and that we expend billions and billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in critical munitions we could use to defend ourselves in the fight against Vladimir Putin because he was Hitler. Again, things look very different right now. But at the time, everybody in D.C. in both parties bought that story. The Democrats were all for it. The Republicans were all for it. This isn't the first bipartisan regime change war we've tried to fight. It's one of many. And in the course of that war, we expended a lot of critical munitions that we might be able to guarantee Israel's safety with now. But it looks like, from all available reports, we're running low. In fact, we're getting some, apparently, anti-drone technology from Ukraine. Savor that irony for a moment, if you would. So whatever the cause, and there'll be, one hopes, time enough for finger-pointing and blame and reverse engineering in an attempt to understand what we just went through. The fact remains, it seems unlikely that the United States will be able to guarantee the safety of Israel. We can't guarantee it now, despite a real effort to. So what does that mean? Well, it means that at some stage, it is possible that Israel will feel it has no choice. You hope they feel they have no choice. They're not doing it for fun. But in any case, they might have to resort to a nuclear strike on Iran, which would be a tragedy for the people of Iran, most of whom have nothing to do with any of this, who would get vaporized. It would be a tragedy for the region, which would be poisoned by radioactive fallout. And it would be a tragedy for the world because the last taboo would be shattered. Truly the last taboo. You can literally castrate yourself and call yourself a woman and you get applauded. There are very few taboos left. Using nuclear weapons is the last remaining big taboo. And once that is gone, we know from the elimination of other taboos that things change really fast. Oh, it already happened. I think I'll try it. And you could very easily see, either quickly or over time, a series of nuclear exchanges that kill most people on Earth. So that would be a huge deal. For the first time in 80 years, a nuclear weapon would be used. And it's by the way, not an attack on Israel, to note this, though they have been very eager to threaten it in the past. Their threshold is much lower than most people's, but still you can kind of understand it. If Israel gets targeted for destruction by Iran and the United States isn't there to reliably protect Israeli cities, they could use nukes. And then we could see truly the destruction of a lot of the world. So you don't want that to happen. In fact, you have to stop that from happening. You have to decelerate. But how do you do that? And again, without too much gloating, because this is no time to gloat or say I told you so, this is actually one of the reasons that some people argued against this conflict in the first place, because like all wars, much easier to get in than to get out. So there are reports today, which again could be lies, probably. Again, everyone lies in war. Everyone has incentive to. But there are reports that don't seem totally crazy that envoys from the United States have suggested that our country might be open to some kind of ceasefire. Like, hey, let's settle down for a second. And the Iranians, whether they're telling the truth or not, but the fact that they even go to the trouble of lying about this tells you something, have said, no, we're not doing that. Why would we agree to a ceasefire when your previous diplomatic efforts were clearly dishonest and didn't work in any case? We couldn't trust you. Is diplomacy itself the search for a peaceful revolution to violent conflict? Is that even a category anymore? Who knows? But apparently the Iranians have said, no, we're not interested in a ceasefire. And they're probably bluffing too. Of course, everything's a bluff. This is the Middle East. But the fact that they're coming out and saying that does point to a fundamental problem that, propaganda aside, is totally real. And that is the United States is not wholly in charge of what happens next. We can, of course, influence it, definitely. But if you're a middle-aged American, speaking for myself, and you've lived your entire life in a country that called the shots globally, a country that issued blue passports to you that were basically your amulet of protection, no one could really mess with you when you have an American passport because the United States set the terms for global trade. It had the greatest military. In the end, no one's really going to mess with America. And if we want to shut down a war or start a war, we can. And there are no existential consequences to us. We're not going to get blown off the map for starting a war, especially with like small primitive countries. So we did it a lot. But this is the first conflict of our lifetimes where the United States is not fully in charge of what happens next. And that's because there are not just one, but two other players in this calculation. And as noted, the first is Iran. And they fully understand that all they need to do is survive, and by surviving, they become much more powerful than they were when this started. And they have all kinds of other reasons to want to continue. The most obvious being, and you're not allowed to say this, but it's true, is that unconditional surrender leaves you open to who knows what. And most non-degraded people, most people with any self-respect of any religion in any part of the country, understand that you can never unconditionally surrender, because in so doing, you've given up your humanity. You can't do that. Would you unconditionally surrender your family to someone else? No, of course you wouldn't. Who would do that? And if you would do that, then you don't deserve to have a family or be the head of a household, because you're degraded. You have no self-respect and you have no real love for those you're in charge of. It's really that simple. This is not a question of Islam versus Christianity, the West versus East. It's a question of the way people are. Unconditional surrender is a lot to ask of anybody. It took a nuclear bomb to get the Japanese to do it. It took complete destruction for the Germans to agree to it. So if we're asking for that unconditional surrender, the Iranians understand perfectly well the stakes, and they kind of can't give up. So that's the problem there. But the other more unusual problem, really without precedent, is that we are fighting this war in partnership with another country, Israel. Now, to those who say, well, we've done this before, we had coalition ventures, peacekeeping forces in Yugoslavia and Afghanistan and Iraq. Yeah, true. But none of those coalition partners had anything approaching decision-making authority over the mission. It was the United States and its allies or satellite states or countries we have troops in a lot of cases, and they were tagging along in the same way the South Koreans did in Vietnam. A lot of South Korean troops in Vietnam. Most people don't remember that. Why'd they do that? Because we protected them from invasion by the Chinese and the North Koreans in 1953. So they were grateful, and they accompanied us to Vietnam for a brief period as a gesture of gratitude. But they were never in charge of the plans in Vietnam. Westmoreland was in charge. LBJ was in charge. Nixon was in charge. This country has not, at least since the Second World War, handed any measure of operational control in a wartime theater to a foreign power. And why is that? Not because we don't have allies or people we like or people we share common goals with. We've got a lot of those, or we had a lot of those. But because no two countries' interests are identical. Even identical twins, if you spend enough time around them, are different in ways you can perceive. No two anything are exactly the same. And nations, which are complicated, don't even have that many points of intersection in their interests. There's a lot that separates the national interests of two separate countries. So if you enter a war co-joined with another country, you're going to reach a point very soon where your interests diverge from those of your partner. And in a war, the stakes are very, very high. So you would never do that, ever. If you cared about your country, why would you do that? And of all the things that historians will reveal in the aftermath of this war, the one that some of us should be paying the closest attention to is who made that decision? Who decided it was okay for the United States to be yoked to a foreign nation in the middle of a war with a country of 92 million people? That is one of the craziest things this country's ever done, and the people who decided to do it should be exposed and they should be penalized. Because that single decision will cost, unfortunately, this is likely to be true, more American lives. It may extend this far past a point where the American interest is served. And by the way, we are approaching the point at which we get no more returns from being engaged in this war. If you know that you're going to negotiate your way out of something in the end, in other words, if you're not going to destroy each other with nuclear weapons, demand total abject surrender, but if you think there's even a possibility you're going to have to negotiate your way out of something, you want to do it at the apogee of your power, at your most powerful point. You don't want to do it when your power is obviously decreasing. Like, say, when you start to run out of weapons because you sent them all to Ukraine because Ben Shapiro demanded you do that. And why wouldn't you want to negotiate when your weakness is obvious? Because you'll get worse terms. The United States has a true national interest in controlling or having a say in the flow of energy out of the Persian Gulf through the Straits of Hormuz. If you could narrow down our interests to just one, we have many interests, but just one, it's that. It's very important for the United States to have some say in that. And if we negotiate our way out when we're weaker rather than stronger, we will have less say. And if we negotiate our way out in humiliation, God forbid that doesn't happen, we will have almost no say at all. And so it is very important to begin those conversations. Now, if you think there's a possibility we could negotiate our way out, if we don't have to go to nukes. And let's hope that we do believe that. So what stands in the way? Well, again, as noted, the Iranians, they've got to be reasonable and willing to bend a little bit, and that's not easy because they're not that reasonable and they're inflamed right now. But it's not just the Iranians, it's Israel too. And from the very first day, Israeli priorities have taken precedent over American priorities. American national interest has been pushed down, and in its place has been elevated Israeli national interest. And what specifically are we talking about here? Think about the target list. So the first big strike of the war eliminated the Ayatollah, who was 86 years old and not simply the head of state technically, but the head of a religion, Shia Islam. Apparently had prostate cancer and was totally willing to be martyred. So that alone should tell you, wait a second, why would we kill that guy? He may be bad. He may be the most evil person in the world. Mark Levin tells us he's Hitler. Great. Or bad. We're against that. We're against Hitler. But killing him will have what effect? 60 seconds. Predict. Oh, maybe it will unite the country on religious grounds and make the opposition to the United States and Israel stronger. Maybe it's also a kind of point of no return after which you can't really negotiate your way out. You killed our religious leader. When was the last time America killed a religious leader? It's not a defense of the Ayatollah. Sorry, Ben Shapiro. It's not a defense of Shia Islam. It's a defense of American national interests. And if you're having trouble remembering the last time we killed a religious leader, it's because we haven't killed any religious leaders, at least not openly. Because we don't want to start religious wars. Because they're hard to fight and very hard to resolve. And how is that good for us? How is that good for our access to LNG and oil from the Gulf? Tell me, Ben Shapiro, can you find the Gulf on a map? No. So why did we do that? Now, we don't know exactly why we did that. Maybe there were American military planners who thought sincerely, hey, I've got an idea. Let's kill the Ayatollah. Then all the liberal elements in the country will rise up. They won't actually discover their latent Shia Islam and rally around an 86-year-old man who was killed along with his family. Maybe there were actually American military planners who thought that, but more likely, there were Israeli strategists who realized that once the United States kills the Ayatollah, kind of can't get out. We're all in. And you also got to suspect that Israeli priorities may have informed our tragic decision to bomb, and it was revealed today it was, in fact, tragically the U.S. military, by mistake, bombing a girls' school attached to an Iranian naval base where the daughters of naval officers went to school, and over 100 of them were killed. Well, that's just terrible, okay? America doesn't do stuff like that, and actually doesn't. And the times that we have done it, we've apologized and prosecuted the people who did it. When civilians are killed in large numbers and it becomes public, the United States military, going back hundreds of years, has felt a moral obligation, being a Western, not an Eastern country, to apologize for the death of innocents and punish the people responsible. It's happened a lot. Because we don't do things like that. Israel does do things like that. Israel sets off pagers in the pockets of people they can't identify. They're just out there. They're going to go off and they'll kill some terrorists and maybe some others, which they did. And that's the price they're willing to pay. That's not a price that we're willing to pay because we're not Israel. So you have to wonder, like, how did this happen? So the U.S. government is saying this was a tragedy. It was a mistake. Totally believable. It was a case of bad targeting. Where did the targeting come from? That's the question. Where do we get those targeting numbers? Oh. We don't know, of course, but it's worth asking. Where do we get those numbers? And by the way, where do we get the intel upon which we made our assumptions that we should go into Iran and that there was a huge and anxious group of liberal-minded Iranians who wanted to throw off the shackles of theocracy and that just a few choice bombs would unleash the desire for freedom within, and they would do the work for us and affect regime change themselves, and that from among them would arise a pro-Western leader. Why did we think that was true? It turned out not to be true, unfortunately. Well, it may not surprise you to learn that almost all of our signals information, our SIGINT, out of Iran is translated by our ally and partner in this war, Israel. Now, that's not to suggest that the Israelis, who have a lot of Farsi speakers among them, because there are a lot of Iranians who moved to Israel, Persian Jews who moved to Israel, it's not to suggest that the Israeli government would in any way be tainting or withholding or mistranslating or skewing this electronic intelligence to get us into a war that doesn't serve our interests. I mean, really, who would do that? But it raises the question of incentives. So just to be clear, Israel has an incentive for the United States to stay in this conflict and make sure that Iran doesn't win, because if Iran wins, that's an actual existential threat to Israel, for real. Ben Shapiro's already running existential threat to Israel. Okay. Its nuclear program was not an existential threat to Israel. An Iran that emerges intact after this conflict is an existential threat to Israel. That is true. That's not an overstatement. So they have every incentive to keep us in and to tell us lies about the nature of the threat in Iran, about what they think is going to happen next, about chatter they pick up on the ground in Iran. They have every incentive to skew the SIGINT in their favor. Now, it's not even an attack on Israel, by the way. The second you join in an enterprise like this with a foreign country, you are certain to get problems like this. And by the way, to be fair, trying to be fair, the Israelis apparently are a little bit frustrated too, because they look over, they've got a whole set of priorities that are very important to them, and we don't share them all. Ground troops would be a perfect example. They would like ground troops. Flat out, they would like ground troops. Why wouldn't they? Our ground troops, not theirs. They're busy invading southern Lebanon and cleansing Lebanon, including Christian villages in Lebanon, killing a priest. Now, why would Israel be invading Lebanon right now? And they've lost people doing it, by the way. It's been a slog for them. Well, strictly speaking, it's because Iran activated Hezbollah, which is a proxy for Iran, in southern Lebanon. They started attacking northern Israel. Okay. Who could have seen that coming? Just because they killed the leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, a year ago, doesn't mean it doesn't exist anymore. Of course it does. But the effect of this is not attacking anybody, just noting it, is the United States is all in, trying to defeat Iran, push back these attacks on all of our allies in the Gulf and on Israel. And Israel is taking this opportunity to grab more land in southern Lebanon. So we're fighting Iran while they're taking over contiguous land from one of their neighbors and cleansing it of Arabs. How is that in our interest? Why would we want to take credit for that? Why would we be in favor of that? I mean, that's a problem for Israel to deal with. But that's what they're doing. And of course, that's always what they were going to do, because Israel is acting in what it claims is its own interest, or what Benjamin Netanyahu believes is in his own interest, because we don't have the same interests. And that was very obvious in the first hours after this, when the prime minister of Israel, in his, I think, first remarks on the new war with Iran, said two things. One, I've been waiting for this for 40 years. This is part of a pre-existing plan, totally disconnected from Iran's modern nuclear program, which was not in the same condition 40 years ago. If you've been thinking about something for 40 years, you're probably not describing an imminent threat. Hard to be imminent for 40 years. This is an effort to expand the territory and the influence of Israel in the Middle East. Of course. Again, not an attack on Israel, it's just a fact. That's the first thing he said, revealing his motive, just saying it out loud. One wonderful thing about Israelis is, unlike Americans, they're less circumspect. Just kind of say it. And the second thing he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's about right, he said in today's Torah portion, we read about the Amalekites, about Amalek. And that would be a direct reference to 1 Samuel 15, in which God commands the Israelites to kill the Amalekites. All of them, every single one of them, to commit genocide against Amalek. The men, the women, the children, the infants, is almost verbatim quote, and the animals. The camels and the sheep. All of them. Kill them all. Wipe them off the face of the earth. And in fact, God punishes the Israelites for not following his instructions and sparing some. So whatever you think of that, whether it's your theology or not, your religion or not, it almost doesn't matter. In a geopolitical context, no one has talked that way in 80 years. No national leader has stood on camera and said, our goal is genocide. And not like semi-modern Nerf genocide, where you kill a lot of people, make the rest of them leave, but actual genocide, where you kill everybody and their children, quote, and their infants, and their animals. You erase any evidence that ever existed, period. It's 1 Samuel 15, in case you're interested